So, Rich, welcome to Dad Edge. I was thinking before we hit the record button that I really just didn't want to do this interview because I'm pretty burnt out, and I'm just so burnt out on podcasting today that I just didn't want. I'm just kidding, obviously. This is such a good topic, man, especially for us as men, husbands, and fathers. But welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a great honor to be here. I love what you do, and I love that I might be a part of helping someone.
Same. Well, I don't know if you'll really help anybody because men, husbands, fathers, providers, leaders, we don't get burnt out on anything. We just keep going.
And we
Everything
don't
is
need
fine,
help
good,
either.
busy. We don't need help. Come on, that's a sign of weakness. But I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. But I'm curious, how did you even get involved with this type of work of burnout?
So I came to the work through my own story of burnout, and upon reflecting on what happened, I lost my job, and it really, as I looked back on it, I really figured out that a lot of the reason I lost the job was because of the symptoms of burnout and the things that I was going through that really illustrate that I was burned out. So many different things, but ultimately, like complete disengagement with work, as well as distraction, being completely distracted and uninterested in finding less distractions in the work. And those were two huge things. But I come to the work of it because I don't want other guys to go through what I went through.
So when you were going through it, the burnout, you mentioned distractions. Like, how did
Mhm.
distractions show up for you?
So I did a lot of stuff that would that drew me away from the work that I was supposed to be doing. So whether it was looking at my phone during the day, or closing my door and avoiding people during work, avoiding the people that I was supposed to be working with. That was part of the distraction. But then a lot of the other distraction was that I just wasn't focused on learning how to do the work better. My entire career, I had focused on like where can I go next? What can I do better? What can I do better? And about 2 or 3 years ago, well, three and a half years ago, I kind of stopped worrying about like what I could do better. And I didn't know any of these things were a sign to burnout. I was just bored, and so once I figured that out, and it was only after I lost my job that I figured that out and started looking at, wow, this is a story that started not only 3.5 years ago, but ultimately my entire professional career is one of burnout. And so if I can help, like that's why I'm trying to help people, because I don't want
Hmm.
them to going through the things that I've been through. I'd rather them learn from my story and be able to, you know, figure out what's happening right now, as opposed to waiting until something more significant happens, like a loss of a job.
What were you doing? I know what you were doing, but share with the audience what you were doing. And I would love to just know the breadcrumbs now that you're looking at this, in the rearview mirror.
Mhm.
Things become much clearer to us when we look back versus when we're in it. But I would love for you to share, what were you doing? And then what were some of, distraction was obviously one, but I would love for you to just get even more specific if you don't mind.
Sure. So I was in education. I was a teacher for 11 years, and then I went into administration. So I was a school administrator for about 8 years. And as a school administrator, the effort was to make sure that the school was running properly, but also to make sure the kids were doing what they needed to be doing. I was a disciplinarian to a degree. I was a teacher observer. I really helped to evaluate and tried to help everyone improve their craft. And that was a when I say that, the difficult part of that is I wasn't improving my own craft anymore. I kind of finished improving my craft. I wasn't doing that anymore, and I was trying to help others improve their craft. So that ultimately was what I was doing. I was a school administrator. Like I said, I was an assistant principal. And before that, I had been in the Army. I was in the Army for 4 years, and then I directed bicycle tours. And throughout my whole professional career, it was one where I was just like, go, 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 constant, 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 without stop. And just by the nature of the jobs that I was in. And so when I came back to the the ultimate process of it, I started realizing that like I've said, I was no longer interested. But the one thing that sticks out, and I'm sure others will come up as we talk, but one thing that sticks out was when I was told, my supervisor said, I want you to we do a goals sheet every year. And in that goal sheet, you're supposed to mimic what the higher ups do, right? But also bring your own stuff in. And I was asked to put something in about becoming a building leader, becoming a principal, becoming a superintendent. And I told my supervisor that I wasn't interested. I wasn't interested in that, and that like, to say that to your supervisor it was kind of ridiculous. And I think about that all the time and think, like, that was the beginning of the end, where I actually admitted to her without really even realizing I was admitting it to her, that I was kind of done. I was riding my time out, but riding my time out to the tune of like 10 to 15 years, and that just wasn't. I wasn't interested in doing that. So I had planned to move on to life coaching, but this came early. This was an earlier opportunity. So that was one opportunity. And there were times where I just wasn't, there were times when I should have been somewhere and I avoided doing those things. And that was difficult for me because a lot of times I would put myself out there. I'd put myself in, I don't want to say harm's way, but I would put myself in a position where I could have more difficulty than it was worth. And then eventually I just kind of stopped doing that. So it was a self-preservation thing, but I didn't feel right in my profession. That's not really how I had lived my life as a professional. I was always kind of putting myself in and getting myself in the mix, whether it was a fight or whether it was, a difficulty between two students or a difficulty, within faculty or whatever. I was always like in there. And I stopped. I avoided those situations more than I usually would have.
As much as this is a conversation around burnout, I also think it could be something that is pretty cool when it comes to clarity on what it is. Sometimes we don't know what we want, but we sure know what we don't want. Your story is kind of similar to mine when I was working in a full-time corporate job. I mean, I was a national sales director for a medical device company for a certain division. And I ran one of the only 1099 sales forces that the company had. Everybody else's sales force was W-2. And I really loved that. I was in charge of about 140 reps nationwide, and I loved that role. And I got to work with men who own their own businesses, and they were 1099s for us selling our products. And I really loved it. I loved it. I loved the environment that it created. I loved the people that I got to work with. It was very different than like a corporate W-2 person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And my boss, I performed really, really well in that job. And my boss wanted to promote me into a vice president of sales position to manage W-2s. And it was a promotion. It was a huge promotion. It was a raise in pay. It was a lot more responsibility. And I flat out for 6 straight months told her, I don't want any part of that.
Mm.
And she was flabbergasted. But the funny thing is, it didn't really have much to do with burnout. It had a lot of clarity around, this is what I know I don't want to do without a shadow of a doubt. I do not want to do that. So do you think that there's a fine line between burnout and also knowing like, okay, I might be burnt out on this current role, but I also sure know I don't want that either.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's part of the difficulty of this whole process is when you're in a role that you're good at and you love that role, more than likely someone's going to see that in you and see that you stand out and then, help you into further leadership roles. There is something to be said for staying where you are because you know what you can do, what you like to do. And it also has to do with, like, I can spend time with my family at the position I'm in. If I take a promotion, that means more, you get paid more, but you also spend more time. And so having personal goals align with your professional goals it gets difficult, especially when you're advancing, especially in high achieving professionals where, you don't get to be a high achieving professional unless you have aspirations to be a higher achieving professional. And so there's absolutely a fine line and a finesse point there because, once you decide, okay, I'm good with this right now, it can feel stagnant, or it can look to other people as though you've kind of settled and you're not really wanting to move on further. So they stop looking at you for any leadership direction. And that's how it felt to me. Where once I made that comment that I did, I really felt like I wasn't in a position where I could move even if I wanted to. So there is a fine line with it. And but the thing is that most people, like, you don't even know that fine line exists, because you're not paying attention to it. You're just trying to, like, on a day-to-day level, you're just trying to, like, keep doing what you're doing. So I imagine that when you were asked that question about moving into a new role, you probably had to do a little soul searching to figure out, okay, what is it that I really want right now, and what's good for me and my family right now. And if they, if the person was asking you over the course of 6 months and you kept having to answer the question, that takes a lot of soul searching, because they, probably they clearly want you to do something further. And I think as professionals, it might feel as though you're the word's escaping me, but you're denying them the opportunity to bring you further. Like, it's almost like you're going to offend them by not taking them up on the next offer.
It makes sense. It does. When you were going through this, this career burnout, how did this spill over into your personal life?
In many ways, I think well, in a lot of ways, I got divorced. Financially, it was very difficult. I wasn't able to have my kids as much as I wanted to. Right now I have 50-50 custody, and that's because I'm not working at a school district where I have to be at school at 7 o'clock in the morning. Because I have to get my kids up, get them into get them to school, come back to work. I don't have to do that anymore. So now I have the 50-50 custody, that's the ultimate goal, is to make sure that I have the kids as much as I can. But in terms of how the burnout affected me, that it was the divorce, it was the custody piece, it was financial difficulties, it was my health. As I've reflected, these are all things that have kind of come to me. And when I've heard of all these different burnout stories, in terms of, people having heart attacks and people having reactions to stress and allergic reactions to stress, where their lips blow up or they can't breathe. And last summer I went to the emergency room because I thought there was a possibility that I was having a heart attack. And it was a play it safe, like, make sure that I'm okay. And fortunately I was okay. And then you have that whole reaction to yourself. But that was when I look back at all this stuff, it all computes to, I had way too much going on, and I just wasn't well. And it took a lot for me to figure that out.
And what were some of the symptoms that arose? I mean, obviously you end up in the ER, you think you're having a heart attack and that kind of thing, but I'm talking like maybe even more the subtle ones that now, as you look back, it's definitely, I would call it, the emergency room, right? That's like in your face.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, halt, stop for a moment. This is serious. Go do this, right? But I think anytime we are faced with things that overwhelm us, so like I'll give you a quick example. Back in 2017, I took on way too much. And my body and mind, like, literally just sort of waved the red flag or the white flag and was like, I give up. I'm now. There's one thing about me personally. I am absolutely relentless, and I do not compromise on something that I go at. I just don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great thing, but it's also something that could be my demise, right?
Mm-hmm.
2017, I was working at my full-time job, building Dad Edge, podcasting, traveling, going to reps, raising 4 kids, like all kinds of stuff. And I was training for an ultra event.
Mm-hmm.
So I was training for like this 50-hour crucible that I was going to be a part of. And I was working out like an absolute idiot, to be honest. And
Mm-hmm.
I'll never forget one day back in 2017, at the very end of February, I did a stupid workout. It took like 3.5 hours long. So I'm sitting there thinking, like, my God, I need to be able to train. Like, I need to be able to go for 50 hours, not 3. So I would train really, really hard, really, really hard. And then what I didn't know at the time is my adrenal system, I was just completely frying it out. Just didn't ever hit the stop button. Well, that turned into an episode of 33 days of minimal sleep straight.
Mm.
So like hour and a half, 2 hours a night. Sometimes if I was lucky, I'd hit 3 hours a night, but it absolutely decimated me and was this radical wake up call. But here's the interesting thing. Looking back on it, I had breadcrumbs that led me up to that event for probably 6 months that I just decided to ignore, thought it was part of the process, just didn't even really worry. It just swept it under the carpet, right? But for you, were there small signs along the way of like, hey man, like this is a lot bigger than what you think it is.
Yes, but only in reflection. Like
Right, exactly.
right. So and I think that's one of the. I'll come back to that because that's an important point. But certainly the exhaustion, the sleepless nights. I think when it comes to the sleepless nights, it's the being unable to sleep, but also having the racing thoughts of how am I going to do this and how am I going to do that, and I messed up with the kids this, and I messed work up here, and I there's all, and financially what am I going to do, and how am I going to get this thing going, and there's all these different things that are going through your head. So that's certainly that's part of the exhaustion because you're unable to sleep. You're unable to sleep because you're so tired from all the work that you're doing or the work that you're not doing. So you're stressed about, you have I had anxiety about, this doesn't align with me. Like like you said, when I go at something, I go at it. And that's what I do. That's just how I'm built. And so there was a huge disconnect with my head and what I was doing, in that I wasn't going full bore at something. I was kind of, I set it up on neutral, and I was kind of taking, honestly, I was taking things for granted, but I was taking things slow so that I could try to recharge, even though I didn't know what that even meant. So that exhaustion, the honestly, it manifested itself in sarcasm. This is something I've been writing about. But when I look back at my time in this last position, I'm a sarcastic person, to begin with, but the sarcasm was just like, it was almost like a defense mechanism. So that was an odd symptom. And then not being able to keep myself one place or the other. Like if I was with my kids, I was thinking about the poor job I was doing with work. And when I was at work, I was thinking about the poor job I was doing with my kids, or that I couldn't have my kids because of work. So in terms of like those breadcrumbs, yeah, absolutely. Those are the things that I wasn't paying attention to, because they just seemed like they were what you do. You just go through hills and valleys. And I would, there were some times where I would say, my medium effort, or my like mediocre, like me being mediocre is like way better than someone else's highest effort. Just like that. And there's a sense of self-righteousness with me. But I will say that, there were often times where I had to step back and say, okay, well, am I just being a normal professional here, or am I losing my step? And I felt like I was losing my step, but I would kind of defend it as like, well, my mediocre step is as good as someone else's best step. So I'll just keep, I kind of felt justified in that, in a sense.
Wow. Okay. It's interesting that you even talk about sarcasm being perhaps one of the breadcrumbs, because yeah, I mean, I think as you're saying that, like, I think that's one of mine. To be honest, I never even really noticed that, but it's like, how can I use like being maybe a little bit sarcastic to keep people maybe distant a little bit, so they don't see that I'm frying out a little bit. It's almost like it's sarcasm is kind of like this veil of like, it's kind of it's being pretty inauthentic, right?
Right.
But it's also casting a shadow of some things that might be going on. So it's really fascinating.
Right. Yeah. And as, again, like, as I've reflected on it, it's sort of like I was protecting against people thinking that I wasn't happy.
Yeah.
I didn't want them to think I wasn't happy. I wanted them to think I was, I was happy as a clam where I was.
Were there breadcrumbs of just things that your kids were saying and doing, and your ex-wife, things that she was saying and doing, and then maybe even in the workplace? Like it was actually external people that were maybe pointing some things out of burnout that you didn't think that was clear back then because it was maybe you just thought it was part of the process?
No, I mean, I wouldn't have known that. I do remember my ex-wife and I were on a mediation, and we were talking through, and I said something about not being interested in being a principal anymore. And she was like, "Oh," and I said, "Yeah," and she was like, "So you're like," I was always hell bent. Once I became an administrator, then it was like, then principal, then moving on up. And that was the first time she had heard me say, like, I'm not interested in that anymore, because if I do that, then I'm not going to have the kids. If I continue doing what I'm doing, I'm not going to be able to have the kids. And it
Wow.
wasn't like it could even go back to teaching, because teaching was even even a more stringent schedule. At least with administration, I could finesse it a little bit so I could have my kids a little bit. So that was one. If I look back on, maybe that was a way in to see that my interest had waned. My kids, I was more always paying attention to what I was doing, which was losing my temper, yelling. Like I struggle with my parenting skills always, as I think anyone does, but certainly for me, like I've really struggled with that. And I know my daughter has since said, since I left and started coaching full time, has said, like, I can see in you, like you're a little different, like you're brighter. And she's 13. So for her to be able to see that in me was pretty profound for me.
Was there a certain conversation that you can recall that was maybe life-giving a little bit and maybe also a bit life-altering?
There was a question.
Okay.
You're not talking about from my daughter. You're talking about in general.
I was talking about from your daughter,
Oh,
but we could do both.
okay. So I'll talk about my daughter first. I don't know that there was anything. I think it was a gradual sense of, like, I really have to focus on what she needs, and I really have to create my work life around what she and the boys need, and my mom. Like, those are the people that I really need to focus on. And so that, me being able to see that and to understand what they need, and then to try to design my work life around what they need, was more the life-giving element to it. So even though that meant me stepping away from work a little bit, and not being as interested in promotions, that was what needed to happen at the time. But it wasn't because anyone asked me that. No one was asking of me anything. They were just like, I was doing what I did, and I don't know if people really would have felt okay about asking me to do anything or asking me for more, because they would have seen it as asking me for more when I was already trying to handle so much, on my own, being a new single parent, and just like all these different things. There's a lot of other things that were happening in my life that contributed to all this. And I'm happy to talk about that if you want, but that was a big thing. In terms of the life, you want me to talk about the life-giving question?
Sure.
So that was the one of the questions that was asked right before I went and got my life coaching certification was, what is the best case scenario for you if you continue doing what you're doing, versus what's the best case scenario if you decide to move into a different direction? And that was like, I had never heard that question asked in that way. First, never with the best case scenario. It was always the worst case scenario. But when I really looked at it, it was like, okay, best case scenario where I am now, I'm getting a 3% pay raise. I'm doing these sort of insignificant tasks in terms of, like, giving kids detentions for throwing carrots at each other, and just like stuff like that. And I wasn't like, that was not interesting to me. So the new adventure certainly sounded better, and that's really how I chose to move forward, was that with that new adventure, because I wasn't doing anyone any good doing what I was doing. and I wasn't able to teach my kids to be okay with moving in a different direction and trusting in yourself. Like there's all kinds of different things that I like, lessons that I want to teach my kids through this process of moving from one profession to the other at 50 years old.
Have you gotten any type of dialogue or comments from your kids about the decision you made to completely leave one industry and now create your own path?
Sure. Well, I don't see it as leaving. It's interesting to say that, because it is certainly a different industry, but I've seen it as coaching through my whole career, my whole professional career. I've been a coach. Like when I was in the Army, I was a coach. When I was directing bicycle tours, I was coaching as a teacher. So it all led to this. And meaning I'm not like I didn't leave teaching and go to medical sales or something where something is completely not related. My point in saying that is that I led myself to this strategically, by accident at first, but then strategically over the last 4 or 5 years. And so my kids are seeing it as I'm just around more, and I'm able to be around more. I'm able to coach baseball. I'm able to go to cross country meets and go to all their different events. And they've never seen me not be able to do that. But as they get older, they're going to start seeing, they might start seeing that I'm always there, as opposed to sometimes there. So that's like, there's not been any dialogue. Like I said, my daughter said something to me about, that I seem less, difficult to be around. But my but my boys are, they're 6 and 8, so they're not, they're not paying all that much attention to what I'm, to that level.
What's so cool about doing what you're doing is, and I don't think we ever actually even, it's never said out loud by our kids, but they're watching every move that we make, right? And our kids are watching very, very closely. Does my dad despise what he does for a living, and he does it anyway? And I'm not talking about like, there's always going to be things about every job that we do. I don't care what you do, even if you run your own business. There's going to be certain aspects about it you despise, and there's going to be but there's probably going to be more aspects that you love. Mm-hmm. That's like the whole point of one of the biggest points of starting a new business, or starting a business, or do the work that what we call do the work that makes you come alive. Mm-hmm. And, I think that there's a true lesson in, watching your father take risks, and strategic risks, right? Strategic, smart risks, and be smart about his moves. Don't be careless about it. There's more people that depend on you than just you. Right. But also being able to make a radical shift in what you do for a living. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lot to that. I had an uncle of mine who literally despised what he did for a living, but refused to do anything different. And you just saw how it ate his soul away. Mm-hmm. And he didn't enjoy it, and always complained about it. And I remember being younger, and I'd overhear conversations. I'm like, and I also had an aunt that was the same way. And I'm like, why don't you just find something else to do? Like, why complain, or why be in a job? No one's forcing you. I remember even being a little kid thinking to myself, like, no one's forcing you to be there. Mm-hmm. Like, why not just do something different? But it's obviously much easier said than done. But I think that there's an incredible lesson that kids learn, like, hey, I'm going to go bet on myself. And if it doesn't work out, like, what's the worst that can happen? I'll go find a job. Like, I already know I'm good in the workplace. What I want to see is, can I be invaluable to somebody else and bring value to somebody else doing something that I truly love to do. Right. And, but I think our kids will learn a lot from that type of, from that viewpoint. Is it okay if we talk about your situation with marriage and some of the pieces there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm curious, 80%. So we have a mastermind for our dads, husbands, and fathers. It's called the Dad Edge Alliance. Yep. And so we get about anywhere from 100 to 150 applications for that group coaching environment per month. And we have on that 6-question application, it takes like 2 minutes to fill it out, but it gives us some grassroots on what it is that is currently going on. What is it you want? we have 5 different choices. So, what is it about your life right now that you would really love to elevate? And one is, I want a better connection with my kids. I want to create an incredible relationship with my wife. I want to be a better leader. I want to be healthier physically and mentally, or I want to be better with my finances. Those are the 5 areas. 82% of men have identified marriage as the thing that they want to work on the most. So I'm curious with your relationship and how this impacted the relationship you have with your ex-wife. Can you talk us through some of the things that you are going through, but now some of the things that you've learned retrospectively of maybe I would have done this a little bit different, whatever it was. I didn't realize what I didn't realize at the time, but now looking back, I know. But I would love for you to just share how this really might have impacted that relationship.
Sure. So the relationship ended prior to, like, if I was to think about my burnout story, it's like my burnout story is from like 2 months ago to when the relationship ended. And then everything leading up to the relationship ending was obviously how it ended. So I was doing a lot of things. I wasn't happy for a while, and neither was she. And we know that about each other, right? So what was happening with me, and again, this goes to the burnout, and this is something I haven't talked about yet, but like I was avoiding my family. I was avoiding going home. I was working to the point of like I was either working or sleeping. That was pretty much it. I had a job that required me to be at work about 16 hours a day. And when I did have a break, I usually filled that with working on my doctorate. I was going through a doctoral program at the time. So if I, and that those are two very, very difficult things, like being an assistant principal in the school district I was in, but also going through my doctorate was, that's an enormous amount of work. So it was, we during the week, 16 hours a day or so, and then on the weekends, usually 10. And just going through all those. So that was one thing that certainly impacted our relationship, was that when I had time to work, to be home, I wasn't fully there. And when I didn't have time, I was avoiding going home because it was just difficult to be at home. Just with everything going on. So that was certainly something that led into that. And then just the entire need to work. Like, I mean, I've thought a lot about workaholic, and that, we throw that term around just like we do with burnout. But when I think about, like, I really don't, I still to this day struggle with not working. I have a hard time if I'm not putting my time to use toward working. And so that was something where I felt like I had to be working. So even before I became an assistant principal, I was working, as a teacher. You'd get paid a supplemental contract to do the play, or, coach baseball. And I was coaching I directed the theater program in my school. So I was directing 3 plays a year: fall show, musical, and spring show. So that was the entire year. And
Yeah.
so, and I didn't know how to not do that. And then once I did stop doing one of those things, then I picked up another thing, and then I picked up this thing, and then I started my doctorate. So there's always accountable for my time. But all that, as you can imagine, took a huge toll on my marriage. And it ultimately, ended it, really.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot of different directions we could go in. I want you to have the opportunity here to speak to a man who something might feel off in his marriage, but he doesn't know exactly what it is, and maybe he's even struggling with starting the conversation with his wife. But maybe this guy is feeling what you did. He's feeling burnt out. He's feeling overwhelmed. Maybe he's even using some coping mechanisms that he doesn't realize he's doing, like the whole sarcasm thing. But maybe for him it's differently. But if he were to go and just approach this topic of burnout with his wife, how do you think men should go about that conversation? While you think on that for a second, let's first address the elephant in the room that no man wants to ever have that conversation with his wife because he views it as a form of, well, I'm weak if I'm burnt out in the workplace. I should be able to handle it all. I should be able to take on anything. And if I'm not, then who am I and what am I doing? And am I not even an efficient, effective provider? So with all that being said, what's going on in the mind and the heart of a man, also wanting to be able to communicate with his wife, what advice would you give him?
I think communicate is like you just said, three words ago, communicate is the biggest thing. In terms of the way that men relate to women and the way that fathers relate to, the mothers in their lives. If I know that men think that women are going to think that they're weak, but I don't know of a case where a wife has said, "Don't talk to me about that. You're being weak." I don't think that's the way it runs. At least I can't imagine it being like 99%, right? So what I would say first of all is communicate, to say like, listen, I need to sit down with you. I'm going to spell some things out here. Nothing that you did, but like I'm not going in a good direction, and I need to know like how I can not only be supported, but also ensure that I'm doing the best for my family. Because, what I thought I was doing was the best for my family. Like my job was to work and earn money and bring money and work. And, it was like work hard and have good life insurance. Like that was the attitude. And so if I had just sat down and said, listen, I don't think I can do this anymore. I think that something bad is going to happen if I continue on this path. I didn't know enough to say that, and I wasn't in a position where I would have said that at the time. But in terms of advice that I would give other guys that I didn't, unfortunately, I didn't have that advice. To just say like, if to sit back and say like, okay, if it's not just exhaustion, if it's not just I'm tired from a rough day's work, or I had a bad couple of weeks, not a bad couple, like a busy couple of weeks, or if I'm drinking a little more than I used to, or I started smoking again, whatever it is, to be able to sit down and say, I need you to hear me. And I need to tell you, like, these are things that I'm concerned about, and I'm concerned about them for my family, and I'm concerned about them for you. And I want to make sure that I'm doing, that I continue to do the best I can for us as a family. And the preventive, like there's a preventive aspect to that, right? Like if you eventually you might lose your job, eventually you might have a heart attack. So you're doing the preventative maintenance on it to say like, I know I've worked my butt off to get to this point in my career. I don't know if I really want it. I don't know if I even want it anymore. And here are the reasons why. But I think a person has to level with themselves and say, what is it that I'm doing? So it could be like writing some stuff down. Start writing things down. Start observing who you are as a person in your work life and in your home life. And then after a little while of doing that, look for themes and look for things that like, man, I can't believe I said that, or I can't believe I'm doing this, or that I didn't realize how much I was doing that. And then using that to approach your partner and saying like, I have to talk about this, because otherwise it's going to go in a bad direction. I don't want it to go in a bad direction.
So there's an element here that I think we could also really give the men some value here when having a conversation like this with our wives, which is one of a married woman's need from her man is to feel safe, right? And there's an element of unsafety if she knows that her man is completely fried, burnt out, from his job, because that's the family's livelihood, or it might be a big chunk of the family's livelihood, right? Do you think it's also, if we're going to have a conversation like this with our wives, do you think it's also beneficial to come forward with some safety aspects of this that's going to reassure her, like, I just want to let you in on what's going on for me right now. There's a lot here. And I also want to reassure you that I'm going to make good, solid decisions here, and I want to make good, solid decisions with you. And I'm not going to do anything that's going to like fly our family off the rails or create any type of like, any type of situation where we're like, oh my God, now what? Right. So do you think that that's important?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think if you can be strategic about it, one of the things that I talk to, when I talk to my clients, that I take a two-pronged approach. One is to, if someone's coming and they're saying they just hate their job, they're miserable, they hate everything about their job. I try to help them remember why they got into it and try to help them fall in love with their job again. So remember, like, think back and, okay, why did you get into this in the first place? What were you doing? What gave you joy initially? Where have you lost your way? So there's that angle of it. At the same time, looking at, for someone who's 50 years old or midlife and has a gazillion responsibilities, we're not talking about like a 25-year-old that like doesn't really have much in the way of responsibility, even though it probably feels like they do. Like, it's not as much as a 50-year-old with kids and a family and all that. So while, like, figuring out what you love about your job, but at the same time, let's talk about an exit plan. Because if you try and you can't figure it out, we also want to start building an exit plan of like, okay, what's next? What are the skills that I have that will translate to a new industry or to a similar industry where I can use the things that I still love, but I'm not doing the things that I hate about my job. And having those two things, being able to separate those two things, because you don't want to, it can feel like a waste of time. Like, all of a sudden, people have asked me that, like, don't you feel like you wasted all that time getting your degrees and and it's like, well, no, I'm no, not at all. Not at all. Like, I see all that as fodder to tell me that I can do these things. But it's really important to have those two things, because the last thing I want is for someone to quit their job just willy-nilly and then get out of their job, and all of a sudden they realize, like, they also don't like this and that about their lives, and now they don't have a job. So, now they don't have the solace and the refuge to go back in, go to work every day, and struggle with those different things. So, I think those are the elements that I really try to focus on with someone, because I want to make sure that they make measured decisions, because they want to make sure they're feeling safe. And so when we come back to talking to your partner, talking to your wife, your partner, making sure that they understand that you're having this conversation because you want to make the right, like, rational decisions. Because otherwise, there's an opportunity to say, like, you know what, screw it, I'm out, and like just quit your job and grab your stuff out of your desk and just like leave. And that's no good for anybody. That's just not helpful for anybody. So having an exit strategy, having an exit strategy, that's one thing, but having that conversation with your partner is important, because you're preventing that point where you're like, I'm out. You're preventing that from happening by having this conversation.
Yeah, no, those are really good guardrails, I think, to have. What about getting through the burnout? Now, you mentioned like a good strategy that people you work with is like, okay, well, number one, let's redefine your why. Why did you even get involved with this in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Like, even as you said that, I started to think back to jobs that I had before I had them, I really wanted them, like really, really wanted them.
Mm-hmm.
And then after you kind of get into the day to day, you're like, wow, this is different than what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to the why, right? It even triggered me to think about my last job that I had was working with these 1099 sales reps. It's just like, man, I loved their entrepreneurial spirit. I loved how these guys were just relentless. Like, they were only paid on what they sold. So they had no cush, like, salary to fall back on or anything like that. They were just out there getting it done, which I love that environment. And sometimes you forget about those things, being around those people and that energy. You also bring up, like, hey, if you're not enjoying what you're enjoying, then maybe have a good exit plan or, a shift in some way, shape or form. What are some other ways that, you're just feeling burnt out? And it could be just maybe you zoom out 30,000 feet. And it could be that you might be burnt out on the level of fitness you're at. You might be burnt out on the level of financial stability you have. It might be you're burnt out on the fact that you can't connect with your kids no matter what you do, or you're wanting to be better with them. or you're wanting more intimacy with your wife, and then on top of it, you got this job that's challenging you. But if we were to zoom out and say, it's kind of like some of my life is very fulfilling, but it's also some of my life is the death of a thousand cuts. And I'm not exactly sure what to do about all of this. What advice would you have for that?
So I think the first thing I would say is to try to parse out those different individual areas. The personal relationship with your wife, your personal relationship with your kids, your financial piece, your health, your emotional health, your physical health, your mental health. If you take what we call it like a life wheel, you take a life wheel and say, okay, where are we really having a good time? Where are we not having such a good time? And so if and I think with marriages and divorces, finances is a huge factor. So if I was to take a look at that, 5 years ago, it would have been finances. Like that would have been, here we are. And that would have been a 9 out of 10. And just saying, okay, well, what do we need to do in order to bring that one to, up, so that, because once you bring one of those areas up, you kind of pull it up, and then the other ones kind of start following those. So if you improve your financial outlook, then your relationship with your wife is going to change, because you're not going to, feel you're not going to struggle talking to her about money. You're not going to talk, your relationships with your kids going to change, because you're not going to say like, no, you can't have a crab cake sandwich. You can have chicken, but you can't have crab cake sandwich at a restaurant festival, something like that. It's a very detailed example that I just gave you, that came from yesterday, right? So that's something that happened yesterday with my kids, is saying like, tell my son, like, I can't do crab cake sandwich today, but once you pick one of those up, then the other ones will rise with them. And so that, like, but you have to parse out those different things, because the other thing we want to do is make sure that someone has something to look forward to, and they can say, oh, I'm really crushing it physically. Like, I'm good. Like, I'm having a great time. I go and work out. I have the self-discipline. I have the motivation. I love what I'm doing. I've figured out, I really love HIIT workouts as opposed to running, as opposed to, whatever. I really have found my niche in that. Maybe you're going to a gym. Maybe, you like going to this particular gym because there's a camaraderie around the workouts that you're doing. So let's take that and say, okay, that's the trophy case. That's where we're doing really well, and try to make everything else, follow in that direction. Because the other thing that is that you're susceptible to is like, wow, I don't like my job, but also like everything else sucks around it too. Like all those different things are struggling, and while they may be, you don't want to just highlight that. You want to highlight the things that are, that are going well, to give someone hope.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent in what's going well, right? We in our family, what we do every now and again is an exercise called start, stop, keep. And so what do we need to start doing that we aren't doing today that could serve us? What do we need to stop doing that isn't serving us whatsoever, and we just need to stop doing it altogether? And what do we need to keep doing that is working extremely well, right? It gives us this really good, a really good system to identify good things that are happening, and removing the ones that don't, right? Or keeping the ones that are working well. As we wrap up here in the final few minutes, what I'd really love to do is just give you an opportunity to just encapsulate what it is that a man might be facing right now, how it's showing up for him, a couple of helpful hints to help him at least move the needle. And then if he needs extra help, working with someone like yourself, and what it is that you would do for him.
Sure, absolutely. So I think one of the things that you can, when you hear people talk about burnout, they're talking about they don't have time, they don't have personal relationships, and there's ways of going about it. And one of the things I have 5 strategies that I'll talk about at the end here. But one of the strategies, and it sounds so simple, is that if you take 3% of your day, like if you're a high achieving professional, you're making 6 figures, most likely you're not working an 8-hour day. You're probably working at least a 10 to 12-hour day. If you take 3% of that time back out of a 10-hour day, it's 18 minutes. So if you tell a high achieving professional, I want you to take 18 minutes back from your day. And it sounds ridiculously simple. It sounds, like what's 18 minutes? But to tell someone and to have them try to do it is completely different. Someone who is constantly telling themselves they don't have time, for them to take back 18 minutes, it sounds like a boulder, when it really should be just like it's just 18 minutes. So being cognizant of taking micro steps toward improvement. Another way that I try to help people is spending 2% of their paycheck every month. So because we lose track of, like, we're making good money, and we lose track of the fact that the money's there to be used, not spent. I don't like, I use the word spent all the time, but I really like using the word used. To use your money. But if you take I forget what the calculations are, but it's about $120 a month. If you use $120 a month of the money that you earn from your profession, and just buy something, just like buy a concert ticket, buy a watch, something that like helps you remember that you're human and that that you deserve these things, or that you can have these things. Because I think a lot of times, I know for me as a dad, like every dollar has to be a soldier toward helping the family unit. And there's no self-identification in that world. So that's another way that you can do it. And then another one that comes in is asking for something new. So if you're at a point where you don't like your job, you're really miserable in it, and you're trying to find the love for it again, one of the things that I try to help people do is ask for something new to do. It could be a new project, or it could be, taking on a responsibility that, would switch up the roles in the organization. But something that kind of lights you up and makes you do things that get out of your comfort zone, which will get out of you'll get out of the rut of doing the things that you don't want to do. And I know it sounds counterintuitive to ask for something new when you're feeling burnout, but that can be the thing that really kind of creates a flight mechanism, so you can start enjoying yourself by going to work, because you're learning about things, you're trying to be as good as possible in a new role.
I love that strategy. My wife gives me so much trouble because I am the member of 3 different gyms. She's like, why are you a member of 3 gyms? I'm like, because I get burnt out on the same scene and the same workouts. So I'll go to a different facility where they have different type of equipment, different scene, different feel, different environment. And I notice that reinvigorates my training again, just being able to have different choices. I really like, but I've rarely have ever thought to do that with my job in the past, of like, hey, what new thing could I do to reinvigorate? So we have 3% of your time. You mentioned 18 minutes. Also spending 2% of your check on something that is beneficial to you per month. Ask for something new to do within your job. I believe you said you have 5. Are these 3 out of the 5, or did I miss 2?
Yeah, no, those are 3 out of the 5. The last one is just to ask for help. Well, there's the other one, and this kind of goes with your gym, where you're looking for personal relationships. So kind of take a step back from the family unit, maybe take a step back from work, and finding a way to hang out with other people. So if it's like a meetup where you go hiking, or if it's a networking event where you just go and find other people to like hang out with and find out what else is happening in the world. That was a big one for me. When I left my job, I started going to this networking event, and I had no idea what was happening outside of the world of education. There were so many different things going on, and so many different ways that people were, interacting with themselves and with each other, and helping each other. And that was completely foreign to me. So that was a really fun thing. And I've made a lot of really good friendships out of that networking event. So finding some place that you can go to really enjoy other people in a completely new way. And then the last thing is it's asking for help. Because if you don't allow yourself the possibility that you're burned out, or you don't allow yourself to think about, what's really happening, you're going to end up in a worse position than you are just feeling like you might be burned out.
The story I'm telling myself is, if you really want to put burnout on steroids, isolate yourself even more.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember when I first started my very first mastermind as a participant, group coaching environment.
Mm-hmm.
And the very first thing that I got were the last two things that you said. Was number one, being around other like-minded individuals that, number one, through the things that I was facing, suddenly knowing that I wasn't the only person in the world who is facing these things and how other people have evolved out of it was insanely helpful. And then and then with that, the asking for help aspect really just, it's like the easy button. It's like, hey, I'm facing this. Well, great. Well, you want some help with that? Yeah, I would. What do you got? But you can definitely tell by easing that. I'm a coach myself, and so are you. But I just got done with a 90-day session with a coach, and it was so cool. I didn't realize how much I really needed it or wanted it until I started working with them. And then you get in that environment, and you're like, oh my gosh, yeah, like, where's this been all my life? For me to just be able to unpack some things that I'm facing or dealing with, and then being able to have someone who has no skin in the game other than to help me to look at my life in a fishbowl and say, and very objectively, and be like, because when you're in it, you just can't see it. And when they're like, hey, I think these are the next right things that you do, and here's the things that I think what might be coming. Oh, by the way, and by you unpacking all this, here's what all this kind of stuff really truly means. Just hearing that, you get off calls like that, and you're like, oh my God, like I feel like I could conquer the world. Like I literally, I compare it to, most of us with burnout, right? Or maybe uncertainty or whatever it is. It's literally like carrying around a 100-pound rucksack, and you don't even know it's on your back or shoulders until you do some of the things that you start talking about doing, like getting with other people, giving yourself back 18 minutes of your day, right? Asking for help. And then as soon as you do those things, it's almost like for that moment, you just take the thing off and you're like, oh my God, I can't even believe how much better my shoulders feel, my back feels, everything feels better. So I really like that. And I'm so glad you ended with the 5 strategies, because that really helps us.
Yeah, absolutely.
As far as men connecting with you, what's the best way to do that?
Sure. So if you, my website is richardmitchellcoaching.com, and you can go there and grab a copy of the 5 strategies that I talked about. And from there, we can certainly set up a a discovery call to figure out where you are and what the different things are that you're struggling with, and how we might figure out a way to help you move into something that you find fulfillment in. You get, what I want to do is make sure people get not only overcome burnout, but then really get fired up about what they're doing and fired up about their lives again. That's really, that's where I am. And that's a whole part of this that we didn't really talk about, but that, just getting fired up about life again is really what the most important thing. So that's what we do. And that's, if you want help with that, then let me know.
Awesome. Well, we're going to have your links in the show notes, so men can easily find you. And the show note is a pretty cool number, actually. If you guys go to thedadedge.com/444 for this show, again, thedadedge.com 444, you'll see all the show notes, the 5 strategies that we talked about today, working with Richard, what that could look like, if you want to connect with him, all those things. Richard, this was Rich, this was awesome, man. I really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your insights. And this is a topic that I think for most men, it's hard for us to even say it out loud if we're feeling it. If many of us are walking around with it, we don't even know that we're dealing with it because we haven't faced it. We just put our head down and keep going. But you really helped us peel back a lot of onion layers today to see this for what it is and what we can do about it. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Back at you. Gentlemen, like I said, head on over to thedadedge.com/444 for this show if you want to connect with Rich. We'll have all of his links in there. Let's not live life burnt out. Let's live life legendary, as we always say. We always say go out and live legendary, and we can't do it if we're burnt out. So, with that being said, go out and live legendary, gentlemen. Take care.